let's talk corned beef and cabbage. I'm going to probably do that in some capacity every year because I celebrate St. Patrick's Day every year. It's one of the few holidays from my childhood that doesn't have like complicated feelings surrounding it. Just joy. Now, contrary to popular belief, corned beef and cabbage is not a traditional Irish meal. It's a traditional Irish American meal. The difference being that in Ireland, the more common meal to have for this holiday is actually bacon and cabbage. But when they came over here to America, the Irish were not able to get their hands on bacon. That specific cured meat was not available to them. But they could get their hands on corned beef, and it has some similar flavors. It's salty like bacon is, etc. So that's why Americans of Irish descent have a tradition of eating corned beef and cabbage. Now, my favorite thing about this meal is that it's really hard to mess it up. Like, the only way you can do that is by missing out on one of the three main ingredients: the corned beef, the cabbage, or the potatoes, or by adding salt. Corned beef is already so salty to begin with that if you leave off one of those three ingredients, it is unbearably salty. Back in 2020, I was not able to get my hands on potatoes or cabbage. I was able to get my hands on sauerkraut, and that was the closest I could get. And yeah, it was not nice. And I'll tell you the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy one. One of my friends ate that corned beef and was like, and then the next time I made it for her, corned beef and cabbage, she was like, "You didn't forget the potatoes this time, did you?" And we laughed about it. My ex ate that corned beef and proceeded to tell people that I made things too salty for the next 2 years. Like every time I had people over. Back to the corned beef, though. So what you do is you put the corned beef in whatever pot you want. You can put it in a roasting pan or a soup pot, depending on what you're going to make it with. I'm using a slow cooker pot here. Then you make sure to put the seasoning packet that comes with it in. If you leave the seasoning packet out, it actually is a little bit more bacony. But if you put the seasoning packet in, it gives it that corned beef flavor. And what I do is I like to put the potatoes in kind of around it, just to see how many we need. And then I pull them back out and cut them. Now, obviously, you rinse them off before you cut them, but we aren't really concerned with cross-contamination in this particular case because, well, these are going right in there with a pot of corned beef anyway. They're going to be cooked at the same time. So we're not worried about cross-contamination in that case. What we're worried about is the dirt that they leave from where they were planted. We don't want that in our food because that's not a nice flavor. So I'm going to cut up these potatoes, and then I will cut up an onion, and I'll add that in there. You don't have to add the onion. I just find that I like that the flavor gets a little bit more full if I do. Okay, here you go, and now you add water. Now you have to add some water, but here's where you decide whether you would like it to be more like a stew or like a roast. The more water you add, obviously, the closer to a super stew it is. I'm going to go with a roast, so we're not really covering the meat here. We'll just turn on the slow cooker. Now, if you're worried about the cabbage, I know I don't have it in the slow cooker at the moment. That's because when you're slow cooking or you're making a soup, it's really best to add the cabbage in the last half an hour or so of cooking time. Otherwise, the cabbage gets a really interesting texture that I don't find pleasant. If you're making it into a roast, if you're making corned beef and cabbage as a roast, you can absolutely put the cabbage in right with the corned beef. Although even there, it's still better to let the beef breathe in the oven a little bit and then put the cabbage in after it's been cooking for a bit. And like I said, this is one of the easiest beginner meals because it's not impossible to mess up. But really, most of the ways that people would think were a mess up are actually going to come out with a perfectly good product. If you leave the brine on, it'll come out a little saltier and be a little bit less pleasant to touch when you're putting it in, but otherwise it's fine. I've done that before. My first time I made corned beef and cabbage. If you forget to put the packet on, it'll be more like bacon, so actually closer to the traditional Irish meal. If you add too much water, it'll be a soup or a stew, and that's going to be just like my mom used to make corned beef and cabbage when I was a kid. If you don't add enough water, it's going to be a roast, and that's perfectly yummy on sandwich. If you try to fry it up, yum, it'll come out delicious fried up. If you try to broil it, I've never tried that, so I couldn't honestly say, but I suspect it'll come out pretty delicious broiled. Most meats do. I've slow cooked it, I've pressure cooked it. I have generally, throughout my 20s, I made it in a soup pot. Now, I actually added salt to it even one time, and that didn't come out too terribly because I also had the potatoes and cabbage. So I would say that the thing to remember is not to leave off the potatoes. Because they absorb a lot of that salt, and it makes the potatoes taste yummy. It makes the meat less salty. It's all around delicious.